Since we moved into our house at the beginning of the year, our living room has been a space where our kids' toys just collects everywhere. It's been an eyesore and it hasn't been the most inviting space to be in. So it's time for a change. And yes, I did go to Ikea, but more on that later. The first thing is to cover up the small existing nook that we used to use as a temporary bookshelf. I framed the opening using 2x4s and a few pieces of drywall to cover it up. If you've been watching my videos, you know I hate drywall, so this was not fun at all. I also gave the entire room a fresh coat of white paint, which I didn't get to record. You just have to trust me on that. The entire media center will be 17 foot long, 8 foot high, and 16 inches deep, which will cover up that entire wall. The idea for the design is to make the base look more solid and have bigger proportions, then make the upper section more open. This way, having such a large media center in a relatively short room won't make it feel so closed off and even shorter, which it worked out in the end. There's a lot of plywood for this project, so that means a lot of breaking down of the sheet goods, and I'll try not to bore you with all of that. One tip is to try to cut all the same dimension at one time, so you don't have to move the table saw fence to throw off your measurements. I cut all of the width dimensions, and then the length dimensions, and finally the height dimensions. Between the table saw and miter saw, I was able to get everything broken down in a relatively short amount of time. I used the miter saw to rough cut the dimensions and then finalize the cut on the table saw. I did get sent this battery powered miter saw and table saw from Bosch to try out for this build. It definitely was nice to have the spare table saw to use when I forgot to make some parts for the base. I didn't have to redial in the cabinet saw in that case to throw off my dimensions. For this build, I'm trying to keep it under $2,000 in material costs. I did go over a little bit, but it was close. Most of the cost was in the white oak plywood, which you'll see later. For the base cabinets, I prefer to create a base structure rather than create a toe kick in the side panels. For me, it's easier to level things this way and reduces the overall time I spend on building the cabinets. Because I'm on a budget, I'm going to use a lot of scrap wood I have laying around for the cabinet bracing. And I originally decided to keep the back of the cabinets open, which was changed later because I didn't really like how it looked. So I ended up adding a panel to cover it. With the base done, I headed to Ikea. Yes, I went to Ikea. I guess it doesn't make me a woodworker anymore. I mean, I wouldn't go there for furniture pieces that I want to use long term, considering how we bought a dresser a few months after we got married, and after light use, it only lasted about 6 months. But for this, I thought their laminate countertops would work perfectly fine, and for under $200 for everything, that's really hard to beat. I thought of using quartz, but it would have been about $3,000 to $4,000 alone just for this area. The nice thing is I can use my table saw to cut down the laminate and form the thicker edge profile, which will add more of the heavier scale to the lower section of the build. For this, I created a miter edge on the main top section and the offcut, and then I glued it together. Pretty simple and straightforward. The overall width was perfect for that 3.5-inch lip with no wasted material. The final piece of the base was to create the face frame, which will cover the edge of the plywood. I'm using riftsawn white oak since the grain is straight and it'll fit with the riftsawn white oak plywood panels that I'll use for the entire project. I milled everything down to 3/4 of an inch thick and 1.5 inches wide. To attach the frame to the plywood, I use a little bit of glue and 23 gauge finish nails. I can pull out some of that nice riftsawn white oak plywood that I absolutely love. I'm going to essentially cover the entire media center in this except for the back panel of the upper section and of course the white countertop. Since I'm going for a solid base look, the doors will just be flat panels with an integrated pull that was cut at the top of the panel at a 30-degree angle. The edge of the doors were covered with peel and stick white oak edge banding, but I didn't have a piece wide enough to cover the top section where the door pull was cut out. So I created this using scrap hardwoods from milling down the face frame. Scrap wood is going to be a pretty common theme here. After trimming and sanding the edge of the laminate, I can test fit the doors using this Craig door mounting jig, which is super handy. I really recommend it if you are going to mount doors. It's really handy. You don't have to like balance things with one hand while you're trying to screw things in with the other. It's a life-saving jig for sure. Now with the base component pretty much done, I can move to making more of the complex part of the project, which is to build the arch. I'm creating this in 3 sections. 2 leg piece and the middle arch portion. For the leg piece, I'm going to create a frame using, you guessed it, scrap wood. The frame will be hollow with the exception of a few areas for blocking for the shelves that I'll install later. I wanted enough wood to screw the frames for my shelves into, and the blocking will help with that. Now for the arch portion, I'll frame out the top of the arch using more scrap wood. I'll then hit the easy button on this and use my CNC to create the arch shape. Once it's cut out, I'll flush trim everything on the router to clean up the edges. I'll test fit everything to see how it looks, and it turned out a lot better than I thought. Finally, I can cover the leg sections using 3/4 inch plywood. Now onto the back panels of the arches. I didn't want to use riftsawn white oak here because I felt like it was just too much, and adding a little bit of subtle texture and a little bit of difference in the design, I think it'll emphasize the arch much better. I found this peel and stick wallpaper on Amazon. It has a gray tone to it with a little bit of texture. My wife loved it, and so that's what I used. I've never applied wallpaper before, so the first panel took a little bit longer than expected. I found that the best way to apply it is to do it in small sections. I scored the back to remove some of the paper covering and slowly made my way from the edge to the center where the wallpaper would overlap slightly on the other side. I used a plastic scraper to smooth out the wallpaper and push out any of the bubbles. I took my time doing this because those bubbles definitely could ruin the wallpaper and create folds on it. There are some areas where it wasn't perfect, but it was going to be at least covered by the shelf, so I wasn't too worried about it. With the back panel finished, I took all of these sections and assembled it in the house. Everything was attached using screws, which went together nicely. I added some clamps just to hold it in position so the arch and the legs were nice and tight. The back panel was nailed in place using 18 gauge nails. I don't have this in the video, but I added a strip at the very bottom edge, which you can see here. It is a little flimsy, so the strip added some structure rigidity to that bottom lip. Without it, the panel would simply detach from the nails. So if I were to do this again, I would probably add a few strips running along the backside just to act like a clamp to hold the panel in place. And then I also added a few small blocks along the edge that faces the TV. This edge will act as a lip later on whenever I attach the plywood panels behind the TV. It'll make sense later on. So it turns out gluing a bunch of scrap plywood pieces together can be quite heavy. I thought I could have done this myself in one shot, but my back told me not today. And because I didn't leave much gap between the arch section and the ceiling, I couldn't tilt it in place since it kept bumping up against the ceiling. So I got a small stepladder and sort of shimmied it up in place and then slid it over onto the countertop. I added a drop cloth just for some protection and it worked out fine. With both sections up, I can start covering the underside of the arch using a 1/4 inch white oak plywood. To get the bend, I needed to create a bunch of curve cuts behind the panel. I did this on a test piece on the table saw, and that just took forever. And of course the spacing and depth was inconsistent. So it's time to hit that easy button again. I left a little bit over a 1/16 of an inch of material, which I found was just enough to bend the panel in place and not have the finished face crack. As I applied the panel onto the arch, I realized in the first one that there wasn't enough support to hold the shape in place, which made it very hard to keep the seams at the top even. So I added a few more pieces of blocking on the underside, which then gave me more points of contact for the nails. I used 23 gauge nails and you can't really see them in the end. If I were to do this again, I would apply the panel in 3 sections. One section for the arch portion itself, and then 2 straight sections for the legs. I would also hide the seams behind the location of the shelves so it looks cleaner and more seamless. I mean, this isn't too bad here, but you could definitely notice where the 2 panels meet at the very top. Just a little thought in case you're doing something like this yourself. This was probably the most time consuming and hardest part of the build, being that it was my first time building a arch at this scale. Definitely learned a lot, and I'm really happy with the results in the end. The next part is to build out the top section above the TV, as well as add blocking behind the panels where the TV will be located. Blocking in this area will give support for the finished paneling that will be installed, as well as support for the TV brackets. I used a combination of 2x4s and, you guessed it, more scrap plywood. There's so much you can do with scrap plywood, and it's great for these situations where everything will be hidden, so you don't have to really worry about what it looks like. I gave myself a bit of wiggle room when adding the blocking for the TV brackets, as well as structure for the shelf. I made the blocking a little bit wider, giving me a few inches up and down to move things around if I need to. That way I can for sure know there's some type of support back there. And then I'll go ahead and run all of my LED wiring to have that in place before the back panel covers it all up. With all the wirings in place, I can cover everything with the white oak paneling. This wall box I've used in the past, and it's great for hiding all the cables needed for the TV. The way that I'm layering these panels help with hiding some of the imperfections, especially in an old house where things are not perfectly square. I layer the back panel first, and if there's any imperfections with the back panel, the side panels and the other finished panels will hide that. Just like that small gap you saw earlier. Everything will be hidden, so you don't have to really worry about what it looks like. With the paneling done, I'll start on the shelves by locating where the frame needs to be. The frame will be the main structure for the shelf. It's almost a full 48 inches wide, so definitely having a structure to keep things from bending and bowing over time is definitely a must. I'm using plywoods to create the frame, attaching it to my blocking that I installed in the legs previously, using screws as well as 18 gauge nails. As I was building the frame for the shelves, I didn't know exactly how I wanted to build the shelf panels. I was in between using 3/4 inch wide oak plywood or using plywood and then veneering over the face of it with white oak. The main issue here was budget, and things started to creep over more than I wanted. So I left that to the side for a moment and moved on to adding the veneer over the plywood upper sections. This is a peel and stick veneer, which sticks on really well. I've used this in many projects in the past, and over time it has held up really well. These are sourced from my local lumberyard, and I'm sure you could find something like this at your local lumberyard as well. This could be cut using a straight edge and a sharp knife. However, if you want more precision, then I recommend using a table saw. But if you are going to use a table saw, I would flatten it out, let it sit overnight so that the bow won't affect how you're pushing the sheets through the table saw. I didn't let mine sit. I just went ahead and cut it. And it was definitely difficult to straighten out the cut as I was pushing it through the table saw. So my recommendation is overnight, just let it sit and have it flatten out. I covered the entire upper portion with the veneer in small sections, and I overlap each panel so that there is a small lip. That lip is then sanded smooth. It'll look super seamless in the end. The reason why I'm using veneer instead of plywood or solid wood is because of the edge transition. With the veneer, that corner transition looks very seamless and it makes the entire piece look solid. If I were to use hardwood, then I would have to deal with a different transition in the edge. The figuring would be different. And if I'm using plywood, then you'll notice the thickness of the plywood. I didn't want to have to deal with any of that. I wanted to look as seamless as possible, which is why the veneers will work better in this case. To trim off the excess, I'm using a sharp blade as well as a router. If you are going to use veneer, you want to make sure that the surface is prepped accordingly. So any bumps, you want to make sure that it's sanded smooth. In this case, on this section here, there was some small bumps from the nails, and I wanted to make sure that all of that was sanded smooth before I apply the veneer. Anything that is exposed, or if there's any imperfections on the subsurface, it's going to reflect on the finished face. So the prep work is definitely very important. And as I mentioned, I'm not perfect. This area here, I sanded a little bit too aggressively to smooth out this corner. I ended up exposing some of the plywood in the back and created a hole along the face of the veneer. So I just ripped it out, put in a new piece, and that definitely added about $120 to the budget. Definitely learned, and this time around, instead of sanding it super tight, I went ahead and trimmed everything off. It doesn't just hit it really lightly with the sander to smooth out the edge. Now going back to the shelves, I had some 1/4-inch white oak plywood left over from the paneling. So I thought the best route here to save money is to use 1/2-inch plywood as the base, then use the 1/4-inch plywood as the finished surface. So I'll cut all of the 1/2-inch plywood, break it down to the proper sizes first, and then I'll take the 1/4-inch plywood, glue it right on top. And after everything sets, I can trim it to the right size. I'll set aside those smaller shelves to dry and focus on building the large main shelf, which will sit right below the TV. This thing is 8 foot 8 inches long. So I'm going to use this special lumber core plywood because lumber core is much lighter and more stable than traditional veneer core plywood. It stays very flat and it's perfect for shelf applications. It doesn't bow like MDF wood over time, and it's much lighter than using traditional plywood. Even gluing 2 layers together, it was really light and much more manageable than doing it out of traditional plywood. With the large shelf drying, I'll focus my attention on creating the grooves for the aluminum tracks for the LEDs. I'm just using my table saw, making a whole bunch of cuts to get it to the correct width. And then I'll hit everything with some sanding, light sanding, making sure not to eat through that veneer. It is pretty thin, so I want to be very careful. I'm using 180 grit, then moving up to 240 and then 300 before I can apply the finishing. Since it is plywood, I need to cover up the edges with some type of edge banding. I'm going to use hardwood for this. This is riftsawn white oak hardwood. The slab that I have here isn't thick enough, so I need to cut them into thin strips and glue the strips together to cover the entire thickness of the shelf. I'll send all the strips through the drum sander to get it down to uniform thickness and clean it up with 120 grit sandpaper. Here's a quick measuring tip when we're trying to find the distance between 2 obstacles. We're often tempted to just push the measuring tape into the end and eyeball where the mark lands. It may work for rough carpentry, but for accuracy, I would measure from one side first, make a mark near a whole number like 10 inches, then go back and measure from the opposite side. Add the 2 dimensions together and it should be close to perfect. I'm aware you could butt up the tape measure itself against the corner and then add the dimensions of the tape measure itself, but that's assuming that your tape measure housing is perfect, and we all know that our tape measures take a beating, so I wouldn't count on it on being anywhere near accurate. It's a method I learned from trim carpenters, and you know they are very good at getting things spot on. So far, it's been working for me, and I haven't really done anything differently. With the edge banding, I'm just using glue and 23 gauge nails to hold it in place. I added some clamps just to make sure that the edge banding was perfectly flush with the top and bottom panels of the shelf. So far, things are looking nice and I'm quite happy with the entire process. I needed a place for the switch that will control the LED lights, and I thought hiding it below the main shelf would be a great place for this. I got this template from a company called Flush Tech, which allows you to create a pocket for outlets. And the cool thing about it is the cover plates will then sit flush with the finished surface. It's quite nice if you have outlets installed on baseboards or other trim. They have a few standard templates that you can pick from based on the outlet that you want to install. For this installation, I needed to create a through cut so the outlet could fit, and it was barely perfect. If my shelf was any thinner, this probably wouldn't have worked. I'm making 2 pockets under the shelf, one for the actual plug outlet and the other for the switch. I also created some channels inside the shelf to hide all the wires coming from the wall. With all that done, I'll glue on the 1/4-inch white oak plywood and trim the entire shelf down to the right size. Because the length of the shelf was quite long, I threw in a few brackets for support. These are not true floating shelf brackets, but since the shelf was very low, I won't see the brackets, and therefore I didn't really want to invest so much money into the brackets themselves. These were about $50, so relatively affordable. This is where the blocking installed previously helped a lot. Each bracket was installed into some structure behind the paneling, which made it sturdy enough for the weight of the entire shelf. Once those brackets were installed, I can take my measurement and trim the shelf down to the correct length. Now that's snug like a glove. With the shelf in place, I can go ahead and route the wires to the outlets right underneath. I made a separate panel to cover this area because if I ever need access to the wire, I can simply remove the panel, taking out these screws, and then work on things if I ever need to in the future. FlushTech was nice enough to send out these wood veneer cover plates, but since it's already located in an area where I'm never going to be able to see it, I think I'll save the cover plates for a future project. The last thing is to actually install all of the baseboard trim. Because we're going for a solid look, I didn't want a deep toe kick. I wanted the toe kick to sit flush with the face frame. That meant I needed to add some additional blocking in the back and nail the baseboard to that blocking. It ended up looking quite nice. With that, the entire build portion is done. I went ahead and sanded everything down with 240 grit sandpaper before applying the finish. I'm using this wipe-on white stain finish that I got from a local supplier. The stain dried fairly quickly, and I was able to finish the entire thing with 2 coats of polyurethane within 1 day. I'll have links to all the products that I've used in this video in the description down below. Some are affiliates and some are not. However, I appreciate any support you can give to my channel. Make sure you click the like button and subscribe, as it will help me out in a big way. I know I don't post on a consistent basis, and I will definitely try to in the future. So for those who have joined in, I appreciate it so much. With all that said, I can finally add the final touches, like installing the strip lights. These are from American Green Lights, same company that I use in my shop. They're great, I love them. And then add all the cable management for my soundbar and TV. Finally, after a whole month, this project is done. What I set out to achieve was a space that was warm and welcoming. And I think it turned out exactly how we wanted it to be. We absolutely love the space. I honestly didn't like the arches in the initial concept, but my wife thought it would be a great feature. She made the right call on this, and it really elevated the space. I love the lighting and the ambiance we get at night. It has become one of our favorite places in the house. If you like large builds like this, check out my previous living room project series. I will have a downloadable 3D model of this project as well as a step-by-step guide on how I designed it. Be on the lookout for that. Make sure you're subscribed. This has been Bao with Design Craft Workshop. See ya.